So as we start to look at the games business, one of the problems that I see and have historically seen with it is that a lot of students come in and when I've taught this class in person, I will ask, how many of you think you're going to get rich, or I took this class so you could get rich, and you'll see some hands go up, right? And the problem is that that's very unlikely, right? There's a ton of money in the games industry, but it's kind of centered on very few people or very large businesses, and so it can be hard to break into that. If you look at stories like Vlambeer with Nuclear Throne, or or Minecraft especially, then you get the idea in your head that you can make a game and then sell it to Microsoft for $2 billion. The problem is that that's kind of a one in forever situation, and so if you come into this thinking that you're going to be the next Minecraft, well, Minecraft already exists and it's not you, right? And so you need to start thinking in terms of whether or not this is something you want to do, from the aspect of you need to enjoy it, not come in here to get rich, right? There are certainly other jobs that you can go into. There's a lot of programming jobs and a lot of technical jobs that you can go to get rich, right? Or to at least make a good deal of money and have a very comfortable life. You could go start taking law school and learn to be a lawyer or a doctor, and you will spend a whole lot of time in school, and then you will work hard and make a lot of money that way. But it won't be quite the games life where you're going to work hard and then it's almost like you're spending 3 years working your butt off to buy a lottery ticket to find out whether or not you're going to succeed. That's really kind of how the games business feels in a lot of ways. Now we'll talk about some of the ways to make it less like a lottery ticket, but it's really not that you're going to win $1 million easily. And even if you get a game that makes $1 million, it might actually be hard to be rich off of that, rather than now you can keep going even further. So I'm going to take the perspective here that you are, say, an indie developer, right? You're going to form your own company. And, a lot of you will probably come away from this thinking, I want to, just join a AAA company, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, or even established, say, AA or single A indie studios that are maybe still cool, but a little boutique rather than that you'd find with a AAA studio. But either way, you can certainly have a great life that way in the industry, and you will do fine. So this perspective is a little bit like you're going to start your own company and how you might actually survive, kind of moving toward the I'm going to be a Minecraft or Vlambeer type situation, rather than just getting a 9-to-5 job at a games company. And of course, in some cases, it will be 9 to 9 rather than 9 to 5. And that's a different concern for a different day. So I will let you pause the video to read this whole thing. I won't read it to you through the video, but what I will point out is that Tim Schafer here discusses the fact that, one, it's a long haul, right? And that you will make a bunch of games. And we kind of talked about this with the game design discussion as well, that you have your sense of taste, but you don't necessarily have the skills to make a great game. And so you might make some early stuff that isn't necessarily going to really appeal to the market, but someday you might actually, if you make it enough, you survive long enough, you get that first big break, and then people go back and start buying from your back catalog because they're like, that guy's really cool, or that lady's really awesome the way she designed that stuff. Let's go see what else she worked on and what else that team made. Back in the early days, right? It's a little bit like indie bands and whatnot, that you get their early bootlegs, and it's a lot of fun. So you can think of it that way, and it's a cool idea, and it might actually work out well, that people will check it out. Probably there's a reason that people didn't really resonate with your early games, but if you get the big fans, they'll be interested in seeing what you used to do. And so Tim Schafer, of course, we talked about him multiple times now, but he used to work for LucasArts, and he's now running his own company, and his company was purchased by Microsoft, and so he's still going. So he has a great perspective on how to keep going, and of course there's actually a great documentary that came out from their Kickstarter a few years ago, where they actually go through a lot of the nuts and bolts of and the struggle of a somewhat small studio, essentially an indie studio, trying to make it and make this game work. Sometimes I think I should refer to this class as the assembly line class, since that ends up being a model that I use quite often for a number of different analogies. So it also works for the video game business. So one of the ways to think about making the money is that, and we'll get into some specifics later, but there's generally a lifetime for a given game. and it could be a long lifetime. It could be 10 years. World of Warcraft has actually lasted for 15 years as a continuing one. It's a little bit hard to reproduce that kind of result as well. But for the standard games, you maybe have a shelf life of 1 to 2 years where a lot of your money is made in the first year, and then you get sort of a trickle of money through the out years. But you can kind of think of this as a sort of heavy upfront curve that has a certain amount of money the game's going to make. Let's say you put out a game, and you can say this game over its lifespan will make $1 million, and the first $500,000 will be in the first year, and the next 10 years will make the rest of the $500,000, as a for instance. So given that, if you consider the fact that, say, to make a game at all, you need let's say $300,000, $500,000 a year to pay everybody, or let's say it's $500,000 over 2 years, $250,000 a year. Then you, for 2 years, you're working, and let's say you magically come up with the $500,000, and that's great. But then you put your game out, and you start making money on it. You need that next $250,000, right? So if that game did make $1 million and you make $500,000 that year, that's great. But now you need to start thinking about making the next game almost immediately in order to keep the money going, or else you're going to have to fire people and find a new job, right? And so what you start to think about is you almost need like a factory and assembly line kind of process where you are making the game currently that is going to fund the next game, and the next game after that is going to fund the next game. Now what gets scary is that you can't guarantee that the next game is going to be as successful as this one. So if the first game works out, that's great. If you came up with that $300,000 and you were able to make at least $300,000 off of that game, then you're funding the next game in the lineup. But you have to hope that that game is also going to make $300,000, and you kind of need some kind of success criteria. And that's actually where you see a lot of these sequel-driven approaches, or even the Madden approach, where every year essentially they're making just another football game and they're putting it out again and charging people $60 so they can keep funding the next game after that. Now people are probably making at EA or at the top are making a ton of money, but they're also keeping their people alive and afloat, making these sports games year after year that essentially cover their bases. And that's the same reason that you see a lot of sequels as well. That, you know, if you made a game one year that did well enough, then if you make the number 2 or the number 3 version of that game, then, you know, maybe you'll get the same level of success. And maybe somewhere in there, you know, you go from the $300,000 game that cost $300,000 to, well, this one resonated really well, and suddenly it's a $10 million game. And so now you're talking about an entirely different thing. Are you talking about making a $10 million budget game from that point, or do you maybe continue to make your $300,000 game, the one that costs you $300,000 to make, and save your $10 million to keep everybody happy, right? So those are decisions that you would have to make, of course, but the mainline approach is that you have to start thinking of not just this game, but the next game, because the money's going to go away, and every product has a sort of fixed lifespan, a fixed amount of money that's going to make it, and it's going to deteriorate. So, and particularly fascinating is Jeff Vogel from Spiderweb Software talks about kind of squeezing every last drop out of your games. So not only do they deteriorate, but never go away either. And there's many opportunities to kind of put games on sale in various ways, or put them into bundles. And he gave a talk at GDC in 2018 about how he has managed to live for many years now, 35, 40 years or so, actually having a moderate amount of success doing things like this, where, you know, every game builds towards the next game and so on, and you can even go back and rebirth some of your old games, but really a way of keeping it forward. So the way to look at this graph is to think of it like, you know, success breeds success, or the rich get richer. And what happens is this kind of chart, a long tail chart, it happens whenever you've got a situation where successful end of things ends up leading to more success. So quite often in hit-driven media like video games, the big hits are popular, and that draws more people to playing those big hits. And so what you have is sort of a self-reinforcing kind of situation where the more popular you are, the more popular you become. And more people hear about you, the more people want to have access to your product, right? And so you get these kinds of large hubs of people, and this happens in all kinds of situations. You get hubs in Twitter where lots of people are popular and lots of people want to be linked up with those people, and so they're well connected, and then there's other people who aren't. You get rich folk who are able to make a lot of money and then invest it and make more money and just kind of stay on the top that way, and so the rich get richer. But it happens with almost everything where there's kind of that hit sort of situation where you get to, a success breeds success. So what we see when we see this is, if we were to picture the entire wealth of the games industry as sort of all of the money that's made, this is what the graph would look like. So what you see is the red side of this graph is around half of the money, and the yellow side of the graph is the other half of the money. And what you find is that the red half is fixed to around 10%, 10 to 20%, right? So if we look at this side, the bottom edge of this curve here is all the products, right? And so the left half, or the sort of the left 20%, the left 10% of the graph is the products that have half of all the money. So if we think of the games industry as being $100 billion, then $50 billion is distributed among the top 10% of the people, right? Or the top 10% of the products. And then the other $50 billion is the rest of the products. All the rest of them have to share the rest of that money. So just there, you can see that, that you're probably going to land in the lower part, right? You're not going to necessarily be the top 10% of all games. You might be in the top 50%, which isn't bad. But then you have to share that $50 billion. Now the problem with the long tail curve is that it's very similar to what's known as a power law curve, and one of the features of the power law curve is what's known as scale invariance, which is, if we were to take the left section, right, just this red part, and we sort of stretched out the red part so that it kind of fit, like our whole graph, we're just going to look at just the red part, and we kind of zoom into that section, what we'd see is exactly the same shape we have here. We sort of stretch it out to the right? But what that means is that the top 10% of the top 10% have over half of their half of the top 10% of the money, right? So if we said that the top 10% of the original set had $50 billion, well, the top 10% of the top 10% have $25 billion. So what that means is the 1% have 1/4 of all the money. And then the top 9%, the remaining 9% of the top 10%, have the other $25 billion, right? So they're not doing poorly. And you can go to the top 10% of the top 10% of the top 10%, you get to the 1% and the 0.1%, and you keep just having the money every time, but you're taking 1/10 of the people every time you do that. And so this is, of course, how we get to the things like the top 1% of the population actually has most of the wealth. Whether that's good or bad is kind of outside of the scope of this class, but that is structured based on the fact that the winners get more money, right? Success breeds success, or wealth breeds wealth. The rich get richer. In the games industry, it ends up being the same way, simply because popular games are the ones that draw more eyeballs, and so then they become more popular. How do you get there in the first place? That's a challenge I can't really necessarily give you a straight answer for. Everyone's trying to figure that one out. We'll certainly have some tips and tricks throughout this module that we're working, but there's no guarantees. So unfortunately, it also works the other way, right? So if we take the yellow section of the graph and we scale that up, and we just look at the yellow section of the graph, so we sort of stretch it vertically so that it fits again into our whole screen here, again we get the same shape. We get that scale invariance, which means that we see, no matter where we zoom in on the graph, we always see a curve that looks like this one, where the top 25%, or the top 10% of that curve ends up having half of the money of the total curve, right? So if we say there's $50 billion in the yellow section, then the top 10% of the bottom 90% has all the half money, right? So if you are, an average, right, you're a 50% game, you're actually kind of way down on that curve. So you're probably in the share of tens of millions of dollars down that road, right? And so the likelihood that your product is making tens of millions of dollars is unlikely. The chance that your product makes several $100,000 at the 50% margin, if you're somewhere in the middle of this graph, your games might make $300,000 to $500,000 if you're fitting around there. And so that's the kind of space that you have to think about, that you have to live in, and that you have to think about in terms of the upfront investment in order to make the next game that fits, right? So as part of that whole treadmill of assembly line, you're working on the next game by being paid for by the last game. Well, the next game's budget really needs to be one that fits in this kind of $300,000 space, and that's how you live to move forward. So, this graph sort of gives you two perspectives. One is, a lot of the money is in a very small fraction of the actual popularity, but there's actually a reasonable amount of money, right? So 50% is kind of, that really is like flipping a coin, and your odds could be better than that, right? We're pretty sure that we can actually get better than just randomly trying to put a game out there and hope for the best. There's actually some strategies that we can use to push ourselves above that 50% line. And the way to look at this in a positive light, so this is kind of the negative light, right? That this graph is a challenge, and the 50% mark, you're only at the, maybe a couple $100,000 rather than millions and millions of dollars. But the way to look at this graph with a sense of optimism is that every percentage point you move forward in space, so if you're at 50% and you can make yourself 51%, your money doesn't increase that linearly. It increases a lot more. So every percentage point you can climb forward toward the left of this graph, the money jumps up substantially higher. And as you continue to pull to the left, it continues to grow substantially. So there's no reason that you have to be stuck at the 50% mark, but there's no reason that you should expect that you can be, the top 10% of all games, right? But maybe you can be in the top 70% rather than the top 50%. So what then is a reasonable budget for a game? Well, it's all of your money and most of your life, as Guillaume Boucher-Vidal said here. And in fact, this article here does actually break down all of the way that he spent the money working on the game, a game called GOD Factory Wingman. And unfortunately, I don't think that game actually did very well. So it's certainly cautionary, but it also is a good breakdown of the kind of money that you can see that goes into a game and how much time it takes, especially as the company owner and the indie owner in this case. And this is one of those rare instances where you kind of get to see one of the ones that isn't a success, and what decisions were made, and can learn the lessons from that. So okay, it's a little bit downtrodden to say all of your money, most of your life. What do the real numbers look like? So there are people costs. These numbers were taken from 2014. They don't change very much, especially in the games industry. There's maybe a few upticks, but over the last several years, it hasn't changed. And so, you might be looking at this as a college student thinking, I'm a CS person, or I'm an art student, and I did not nearly expect to make $93,000 a year or $75,000 a year. Those are very big numbers. These are also kind of averages across the industry and not entry level. So entry level is going to be on the low end, and senior people who have been working for 20 years or 30 years are making the other end of that spectrum, right? So this is the middle. This is like folks that have been working for 10 years or so in the industry, or are fairly senior. So you shouldn't expect to walk into a company and get that kind of money, right? But we can look at this as kind of a ballpark for how much we're going to spend on people, especially if we were to, do the bare minimum here, and you partner up with your friend, and you are a programmer, or you are an artist, and you find your programmer other half, or your artist other half, and you work as a team of two to put the game together, and then you sort of outsource, and maybe rather than hiring somebody to work full time on these other jobs, you're really looking for just outsourcing your audio and your music, and maybe some of your you two together are working on the game design itself, and you're just having to be your own producers, figuring out your own studio space, which maybe is your apartment, and so on. So the people costs in any business are actually the highest costs, right? And so trying to pay people, especially paying people to live rather than taking advantage of people, ends up being pretty costly, especially when you start considering benefits and everything else as well. But just a salary is important. So without going into details, of course, on what's involved in benefits and insurance, if you start to hire people, then you need to pay those things. You need to save out payroll taxes. You need to have some insurance on your employees, all that kind of stuff. The real point here would be hire a CPA. A CPA will cost you somewhere between $500 and maybe $2,000 a year, but will save you from going to prison and or paying massive numbers of fines, like tens of thousands of dollars. So they're worth the investment of not actually that much money. It feels like a lot of money to pay, like $2,000, but if you are making enough money that you can pay for an employee, then there's no reason not to do that. If, however, it is just you and your friend that are working together, you might not necessarily need the benefits, insurance, and taxes, and so you might be able to get away with some of that without necessarily needing a CPA, but you might also be able to find a CPA who will help you for much less, right? So the $500 range kind of thing. So certainly worth seeking out professionals rather than trying to completely go on your own. It's much like you would looking here in terms of seeking professionals for your audio, but having access to other professionals for the rest of the business is just as smart. So there are additional costs in terms of equipment and licenses. So if you're using Unreal or Unity and you're expecting to make money out of those, then you do have to pay some money, right? So in Unreal's case, you pay a fraction of the amount of earnings that you made, or you pay something like $1,500 a year for a strict license to them. And similar with Unity, Unity only has the licensed version, which I think is actually closer to $1,800 now. But those things are all overheads. But if we look at, again, $1,800 a year, or $3,000 for a really nice computer, $4,000 for a really nice computer, your human cost is still much higher. And so there's no reason to shirk on the equipment to suffer if you can afford it. Again, if it's the two of you and you're trying to just eat ramen and all that, then again, you're not worried about salaries, you're not worried about any of this. You're trying to figure it out as cheaply as you can, and good on you. But very quickly you start to realize that you need some pretty decent equipment to work. And so there's no reason to actually shirk the costs on those either, and to pay your licenses and all that, because it really is a small part of your overall budget. Space, if you're in your own apartment, that's great. But you have to rent space. Space actually is very cheap usually, especially office space, because there's not a lot to it, right? It has maybe a power cable and maybe some heating and cooling. But you're probably spending, $500 or $600 a month for quite a lot of just open space, right? Retail space tends to be more expensive than office space, but just renting an office somewhere can actually be fairly cheap. Now, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, $500 a month actually ends up being close to $6,000 a year, so it's maybe more expensive than everything else in terms of the overall yearly cost. But that would also be a very nice place, right? You could probably get office spaces on the order of hundreds of dollars to fit two people. And of course, there's no reason not to work at home or in an apartment if you can share and work on a team that way. So there's always clever ways to work it, but the cost is there. So if we put all that together, then let's look at a monthly cost, right? So we'll look at if we do hire a programmer and an artist, and we actually want to pay ourselves a reasonable rate, then we'll have that value. We'll probably want to cover the benefits. Maybe you look at that as around $400 a month, equipment, etc. We'll look at that as around $6,000 a year, with the expectation we might upgrade our computers every couple of years or something like that. So we'll average it out over time, and then we'll do $700 a month. So a really nice place, right? So one reason to think of this, so I've been speaking in terms of you're working with your friend, and you guys just want to not pay each other as much as you can, avoid the costs. But at some point, you want to make enough money that you can actually start making a living at this. And so what you should do is not necessarily look at, okay, we're trying to save costs in the first game, but how much do we need? How much would we have needed if we actually wanted to make the money here, so that the next game we can actually pay ourselves a real fee, right? So maybe the first game we figure out how to do it on the cheap, as cheaply as possible. How much money do we need to make? And it's around $360,000. The good news is that that's around the 50% mark, right? So if we looked at our curve in terms of the overall budget that all games make, you've got about a 50-50 chance of rolling the dice and getting a $300,000 game. Of course, if you really just go out there and barely do anything and really roll the dice, you probably won't even make that. You'll be in the lower end. But if you go in and put some real effort into it, you could potentially make a $300,000 game. And that is enough to pay for the benefits, your fees, your equipment, and your rent for the next game. So this is kind of the way to start to look at it, right? That it actually is reasonable to make a small game that then does better. And maybe if you can figure out how to make a $300,000 game or $350,000 game, maybe you can figure out how to do something a little better next time, maybe with some extra marketing, or maybe you still do a little bit on the cheap so you can put more money towards marketing, and you get a $400,000 or $500,000 game out of it. And maybe you start to push it a little further and figure out how to make more. So if you can break that first barrier to say, I'm going to figure out at least how to make that much and get moving forward, then hopefully you can also figure out how to improve your skills, not just in terms of your ability to make a game, but how you can sell a game and how you can convince people to continue to buy it. Even better is that somebody who's bought a game from a certain company will start to understand, as if they really liked the game, will start to know what that company is and be looking for other products from that company. That's the whole reason to have a back catalog, but it's also a reason to have a future one as well. Something for people to look forward to want to put more money into. So if you're looking closely, you notice that this was a $300,000 game, a $350,000 game here is a 2-year game. So given the fact that you have now gone through this class and you kind of understand how much work it is on a week-to-week basis to make some of the sort of simple game mechanics that you've put together, you could start to think about extrapolating that and what could you build in 2 years. And it's always probably going to be smaller than you realize. Because it's hard to predict actually how much it takes. And what that ends up leading to is crunch. So there's a book called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, which talks about both some large-scale games and some indie games written by Jason Schreier, which is a terrific book on just the, again, successful games, but at least it shows some of the sausage-making stuff, again, where it's not always pretty what happens, and it's there's a lot of work involved, and it's kind of painful, right? So first I'll speak to if you and your friend, especially early on, are making a game, you will probably work harder than you expect, but you are also working for yourselves, so you get to choose how hard you work, and you will probably cram in a lot more hours than you should in that 2 years trying to make that first game, right? And the reason for that is game development is a lot like making a movie, except that you have to create your own actors, and then you give them sentience or an approximation of sentience. You have to program in their intelligence. You have to establish complete new laws of physics, all of your game logic, whether you're going to use the realistic physics or not, whether Mario's going to fall at a reasonable rate or fall at a ridiculous rate. You also have other physics which are in your system that you have to figure out, right? So you're building a whole universe of physics, and movies get to just use the physics, right? Sometimes you even invent and build a new camera, which is really the render system that you're going to use. In some cases, if you're smart, you're going to use the existing render system and just work on the lights as they are and play with the lights as they are and the fog as you've learned and the whatever render techniques you can pull out of Unreal or Unity and hope for the best rather than inventing your own new stuff. And other than having to create all of that stuff from scratch, then it's similar to making a movie. But that's where a lot of the uncertainty comes from, and that's why games are late, and that's why it's hard to predict how long they're going to take, because you don't start to see the shape of what the game even is until you start to get some of these things in place. And so there's some serious challenge to predicting it, and really how much you can fit. And so there's some wisdom and some sort of personal fortitude to say, we need to stop here. Right, we have to cancel this feature. We have to cut this particular feature simply because we don't want to work more than we can or more than we should. Because we're only making a $350,000 game, we need to cut feature after feature to fit to what we can make in 2 years. And so you have to start just dealing with the realities of the unpredictability of what you're trying to do. So to a certain extent, crunch is inevitable, especially when you're early on working for yourself and trying to figure out what fits, right? So all the stories you will hear about the small companies that run it, the management person is having to work their butts off. So it's probably inevitable, but real artists, real coders ship. Real artists ship, I think, is an Apple phrase. And the problem is that you run into, with more time, I could do better. If I had just a little more time, I could put in that feature. But at a certain point, you just have to cut it. You just have to move on. And so rather than fighting to get the absolute perfect feature in, you accept that the game's not going to be as perfect as you would like to be. And the next game, you might be able to add that feature in. Or the next game, you try to figure out a little bit ahead of time what you're going to do. But you have to put in a deadline. You can't just go forever. If you don't have a deadline, if you don't actually have a limit to where you're going to start making the next money, you'll just go out of business. Or you could be a hobbyist, and it's fine to be a hobbyist, but it means you're not a company. It means you're not making a business work. And sometimes the deadline has to feel essentially impossible to hit, right? That you have to it has to be this December. Now, maybe it doesn't make much sense if you're in September and you're telling your team to make the ET game and giving them 6 weeks, and then suddenly the whole industry collapses. That's probably a little too unattainable, but probably every deadline is a little bit wrong, right? Otherwise, you just end up with never. And so this kind of thing, the fact that you can just sort of keep pushing it back, is very easy to do when you're a hobbyist, and then you'll never release a game. If you're just a couple kids out of college working on your game, and you've gotten together and you've kind of worked on it, you can always push your deadline, right? And you probably will suddenly go from having a dream to having a hobby. And that's fine, but at some point you have to say, this is what we're going to do, right? And a lot of these games, if you have the ability to push out your deadline, Half-Life 3 is probably the best example of that. Valve doesn't really need to make Half-Life 3 to survive. They've got Steam, and they've got the Vive, they've got all kinds of things going on. And really, they could try to make a Half-Life 3, and everyone would be disappointed with what the reality of that game was rather than what they think that game might become. And so it's almost easier for them to just keep making the money they've got and keep pushing the deadline and never making a Half-Life 3. So this is all, working for yourself and trying to determine it, especially when you're young and maybe not as wise as understanding what the game's going to be, but there's also a level of unpredictability to it. If we consider the AAA space, then there's kind of a different structure, right? So it's not just a team of programmer and artist. There is an entire business team on the top level. There's a sort of an executive branch. There's producers that are involved in the game and deciding the schedule and working with the business team to decide how much money is going towards the budget on this game versus maybe all the other games that they might be working on and whether they're trying to release. And so there's actually no justification for a company that's large enough to crunch its people other than that it can get away with it, right? They can force their team to work harder because the product deadlines are going to slip. Really, most companies just pay a fixed price to their staff, and any of the excess money that comes through ends up being profit to the business, right? And so they know how to market, they know how to pull the big money out. They're kind of on the far left side of the curve. They should have some buffers in place, and they should have management in place that knows how to deal with the uncertainty of making games. And then have with that the ability to allow their staff to have reasonable work hours, to have vacations and all of that. And so there's when you are large enough, you should have enough buffers in place to actually deal with those kinds of situations. When you're small enough and you're working from game to game, you kind of have less flexibility, right? So if you really are making a game that you think is going to be the $350,000 game that is barely going to cover your next game, you probably have to crunch. But if you are on the $150 million budget scale and your game should make $150 to $200 million, and so there's a $50 million profit in there, you should have a $50 million buffer that helps you to not have to do crunch. And so there's really not much of an excuse when you're a large enough company for that. This is really, at the level of the lower end. And so it's entirely a mismanagement problem to actually allow crunch to exist in the larger companies. They should, it's folks that essentially want to make money for their shareholders and can, and they think they can get away with it, and they continue to get away with it. So it's not great in that sense. But again, some of the lessons here are still true, and they're true at that level as well. It's just that they should be managed better at that level because they have the ability and the buffers to do so. But it's important to understand that the games will be this unpredictable, and that even when you're trying to decide how long it's going to take you, it's always going to be longer than you thought. Okay, so another sort of slightly negative concern is, if you are thinking in terms of just you and your friend, you should probably come up with a business structure anyway. And that is because things don't always go the way you want them to, right? As we just talked about with Crunch, they don't go that way. You also kind of end up having disagreements, and so having a structure in place that helps you to work through those disagreements in some kind of reasonable way, determining how decisions are made or who gets the final say, or just who's taking the most responsibility in terms of, well, we didn't realize we needed another extra $1,000, so who's gonna come up with that? Are we gonna split it? Is one person in charge of kind of coming up with that extra money? So all that stuff is part of your figuring out your business structure, how the money gets shared, if you actually do make extra profit beyond just what you've agreed to pay each other, and all of the sort of perpetuality of making a game exist. There's also the fact that you will be creating IP that you probably want to protect so that you can create sequels, or you can extract as much money as you can out of that. Often games have a sort of copyright. The IP kind of covers your logos and your game assets. You actually can't really patent a video game because games are considered sort of mathematical formula, or gameplay is kind of a mathematical construct, and so it doesn't get patented. The good news is that when it comes to gameplay, you can actually mine the history of games and see what kinds of gameplay have existed in the past and come up with your own spin on it. Now, obviously, if you made a game that looked and felt and had the same characters as something in, say, a Mario game, had all the same text as in some like adventure game, then you're going to run into copyright protection against that, and sort of the general IP that they can actually claim on. But the actual gameplay itself, sort of the game rules, you can kind of steal, right? You can take that. Game players don't really want to play the same game with a different skin every time, unless it's a repeatable game. And probably if it's League of Legends, but it looks slightly different because it's your own version of League of Legends, they'll probably just play League of Legends, right? So you kind of need to come up with a new spin on the gameplay, but you could start by having a game that plays very similar. Well, in fact, so League of Legends actually came after, I think Dota 2. Actually, there was a Dota 2 that came from Dota, and League of Legends came around the same time as Dota 2. Both of them came from the original Defense of the Ancients. And so that's how you end up also with like Heroes of the Storm and other MOBA type games. That's how you end up with genres at all. Because if somebody could claim sort of patent on the genre, you'd never have other games within that genre, right? And so you can't patent that, and you should look at that as a positive, that you can sort of play a game and say, I like that idea, but I need to change all the characters and all the story, and then put my own twist on it. So kind of going to the same route, there is a good case for non-disclosure. So when we talked about design, we did say that sharing ideas is actually good, and talking about your idea early on can be a good thing. But if you come up with, and that's to explore creativity, to explore your options, to kind of see what's possible in the space of ideas, right? But at a certain point, when you've established your idea and figured out, what you're going to make, and the Ryan Clark video that we will have in conjunction with this talks about putting enough things together that you actually have an idea that is worth something. Once you have that, then it starts to become something that you don't necessarily want everyone to know about, because they could potentially take it and use it themselves, right? So this is where the sort of the gameplay as a whole not being patentable means that somebody can take your idea and just put a different skin on it. And so this has happened, where the company Spry Fox was working with a contractor to help them build the game Triple Town, and they had the game almost completely ready by, I think it was November or something like that, where they were going to release in December, and then suddenly the company that they were working with released the same game before Triple Town was released with essentially a different skin on it. Now this was a contract violation, a non-disclosure violation, and it went to court, but it can be a problem, right? So you can actually have some shady business happen if you're not careful. And so having sort of a non-disclosure, having a bit of secrecy around a game, especially as you start to get to release, and especially with who you're working with, can actually be important. But But early on, certainly in the gestation of ideas, there's no reason to be secretive about your ideas and careful about it. So, and this goes to the same thing, again, expectations. So if you are not necessarily in a business partnership with a person, but they are working for you, there should probably be a contract in place, and especially a royalty agreement, a payment agreement. Whether there are royalties or not, all those agreements should be upfront, not sometime later when you figure it out, right? You have to kind of figure out what you're going to offer a person in terms of money and all of that. And royalties can be a challenge because there's a lot of extra costs that go into the game, right? As we already talked about, if you kind of just figure out the bare minimum salaries and benefits and equipment and licenses and all that, there's not a lot of profit left over. If you set up royalties in the wrong way, you might actually eat into those profits by having to pay out the royalties before you can pay for the equipment and all that on the next game, or just pay back this game, the investment that was put in this game in the first place. All that said, again, this is worth getting a professional, right? So lawyers are very expensive, exceedingly expensive. It's always scary a little bit when you talk to a lawyer and heard stories of people like getting on the phone and setting their timer so that they know exactly how long they're talking to their lawyer. So once it hits the 15-minute mark or something, they're hanging up the phone as quickly as they can. And lawyers will often charge in increments of 5 minutes or 6-minute intervals so that you can get a pretty efficient rate out of them because they know they're expensive. And so some people really only do want to talk for 12 minutes exactly. And so you pay, only 1/20th of their total cost, right? So you pay $50 for that 12-minute conversation. But they will charge you $50 for that 12-minute conversation. And Lord help you if you end up with two lawyers talking to each other about your contract, because then you get to pay both of them for the whole of their conversation. But in the end, despite how expensive they might be, there's a lot of concerns that I just listed that are necessary to worry about. And so having a professional who can worry for you and make sure that you are covered in a way that you can feel comfortable about, especially with language that seems a little scary and will intimidate the people who are like signing the contract or signing the NDA. But that's kind of what you want, because you don't really want them to break it. You want them to be afraid of your lawyer, right? And so it's worth paying that much money. And it ends up only being around $2,500 a year, right? You're not going to talk to your lawyer constantly. You're not going to have to pay them for their whole hours. They have other people that are paying them. But then, and part of, I think, their high cost is that they're paying for their whole structure, and they actually only work for 12 minutes out of this hour and 12 minutes out of the next hour. So they need to get some of that money to cover it anyway. Okay, so that's kind of the end of all the costs that can go into it. So let's see how you might expect to make money. So these figures are probably a little iffy. The low end of Steam at the time of recording is actually 0. So it is very possible, and there are many games now with the way that Steam works, that you will make $0 on your game. And that means that you haven't done enough marketing. There's enough games that there's a wash of material out there, and so it's actually hard to get anybody's eyeballs on it. Right, so if we look at the 50% range, the 50% range is somewhere in this mid-range and probably closer to the 10,000 sales, right? So 10 to 20,000 sales is actually probably the range that you are in the 50-50 for success, right? So if you look at all the games that are out there, you could probably get 10 to 20,000 sales if you're at least as good as the average game that's out there. And so that means that you do have to be kind of above the sort of signal to noise ratio, but that's where you start to hit that $350,000 that we were talking about. And then you can see that there's a lot of room in here to get better, right? So if you've made a good game and if you got enough attention, you could move into the $100,000 or the 100,000 unit range, which means if your sale price for, again, kind of the indie range, which is $15, maybe $20, you could look at making $150,000 or $1.5 million in sales. Now remember that right now Steam charges 30% overhead, and so if you make $1.5 million, you actually only get to take back $1 million from Steam, right? Or if you make $350,000, you only get to take back $200,000 or $225 or whatever it is. So Steam takes the top 30% off your game, and they take that before they give it to you. So that can be pretty expensive. And then, if you decided to make the deal with Unreal where they take 5 to 6% of your earnings as well, they also take another 5 to 6% off that. So now you're losing like 36% of your money. So to make that $350,000 after you've paid all these other prices, you really have to make something on the order of like $500,000 or so. So as we've talked about already ad nauseum at this point in this talk, the high end is somewhat unlikely, but achievable at sort of the low version end of the high end. It's unlikely that you will make a game anytime soon that it hits the 3 million unit sales. However, you could make a game within the next 2 to 3 years that hits that 10 to 20,000 unit sale, and maybe carrying it forward. If you think 10 years from now, you might be pushing 100,000 units. And so you might be able to figure out the patterns that work, that are successful. You can get a hold of YouTubers, you can get them on the phone, or text them, whatever, to get a popular YouTuber or somebody on Twitch to play your game and get attention to it. This kind of happened with Among Us. So Among Us, the folks that worked on that, they were thinking about creating a sequel, and then somebody on Twitch found it. I don't know who it was. Kind of brought it to everyone's attention, and enough people started playing and paying money into the Among Us team that the Among Us team started just managing Among Us and didn't worry about a sequel anymore. They didn't have to move on anymore. So they kind of won the lottery sort of after the fact. And it's a great success story. But of course, you kind of can't plan for that kind of lucky break, right? You really have to plan for, you want to get around well enough that you can get a hold of a popular YouTuber that will play your game. When you start thinking that way, you need to think about a game that actually plays well in that space. So mobile sales are an interesting space. There's probably not as many games anymore on mobile that work for you pay $1 and you just get the game. Generally, those games now go for $0 and you do a free-to-play game where you buy things in the game, and people will be willing to put some money into it because they played enough of it. So the low end of sales of moving units on Apple can still be zero as well, because it's a huge market. It's much like Steam now, or it has always been like what Steam has recently become. But generally speaking, you're a much lower range if you're kind of a moderate person. But there's many more phones out there than there are Steam installs, and so there's a much larger market, and so there's a much higher potential in terms of the kind of people, the number of units that you can move at some point. But it's harder to break into in many ways, especially since a lot of the big companies are actually in that space, because that one's easier to kind of get that. It works a lot differently, right? So since you're not paying up front necessarily, you're paying as you go, you're paying a free-to-play game. The market works a little bit different than almost everything I've talked about here, in terms of your hit game kind of exists for a while and then slowly fades out as the next hit game comes through, because you've kind of played that game out. That's not as true with mobile games. They kind of exist, and they can bring people in, and they sort of have a recurring amount of money that works. And depending on how you do it, you might actually be able to invest a lot less money in a mobile game to reduce your risk. So this is sometimes true and sometimes not true. Sometimes the consoles have worked out. So we had what was known many years ago as the Xbox Arcade, and that actually worked really great for small developers. It was easy to get into. Many developers made great money out of that. There was a period of time where Nintendo Switch offered small developers access to get on the Switch and created a bunch of great games out of that. Sony's done some stuff that worked well. So all of the consoles have sometimes been really great for small developers to come in and make a game for it. Certainly for big developers, it's fine, right? It's just another market that you're going to hit. You put a small part of the team on the Xbox or PS5 port or PS4 port or whatever, and you just put that into your budget, and it's just another part of it, right? But for small developers, it's harder to make that justification necessarily, and so often it will be a PC-only release, and then you will see a Switch or an Xbox or a PlayStation release. And as we move to a new set of another generation, it's almost entirely unknown how it's going to look for the small developer, right? Things might be pretty good for a little while. They might be terrible. The expectation, the sort of, as we're moving into the PS5 and Xbox Series X world, we're also seeing less Kickstarter and more people having to move towards publishers and actually getting a larger budget. And so it's a different space entirely. And whether or not we'll have individual developers or small developer teams that don't have a publisher behind them getting on any of the consoles may not be the case. Right? From what I've seen of reports of especially small developers who have gone on previous generations of consoles, they're really only getting about a tenth of the sales compared with Steam or compared with the Epic Store. And so, it might be that tenth of the sales is worth it, especially if it's fairly easy to get on that console. But it is a big risk, and the competition is pretty fierce, right? You're competing with the EAs and the Activisions and all those guys that are picking up the eyeballs. And so people aren't necessarily buying consoles to find weird indie games. They're picking up consoles to play the big blockbuster kinds of games, right? This is the common gamer, not the kind of folks who are weird and eccentric that might be actually taking this course that want to figure out how games work so that they can make them themselves. So consoles are always a bit iffy. I wouldn't know how to plan around it other than it's an afterthought for most small developers. Something that if there's a chance you strike at it, and otherwise you just focus on being PC only. Okay, so we will have the Ryan Clark video as part of this whole thing, so I won't talk a lot about this. I'll leave it to his lecture. But word of mouth is probably the best way that any small developer gets their game out there. Often these days that word of mouth comes from a YouTube Let's Play or somebody on Twitch that's playing the game and playing through it. Now the problem that you run into when that happens is that if people can see everything they want to see out of your game, like if all of your game is, say, a narrative story or a structure, and there's not really much in terms of the gameplay and what you feel as you're playing it as a player, and you're just getting a story, you can get that story by really watching the Let's Play, and then you don't need to purchase the game. That's kind of really bad for the developer. But if you have an experience that somebody sees a Let's Player do, and you've really focused on the player experience, and they're like, I want to experience that, and they're not going to do it by just watching somebody play it. They can see them experiencing it, but they don't get to experience it for themselves. If you can find that unique piece, or even if the game is unique enough and replayable enough that there's a different experience every time you play, so that you as a player come into this game and you get a different experience than what you saw when you watched the person on Twitch play it. Now you kind of want to get in there and play it, right? So all those games that have replayability and repeat structure, those are very easy to kind of pull this off with, especially with the Let's Play team, right? So Minecraft, of course, is the big one because they're the whole point of it is to go in and create your own thing. It's sort of player as creator, and so you don't get what you want out of it just by watching somebody else play it. What you do is you get the sense that you can create what you want, and then you go get Minecraft and you create your own thing, right? You in fact are watching streamers to get ideas about what you might want to do in your own Minecraft world. So Vlambeer actually put this out. This is a great tool, this dopresskit.com, that helps you to put together both the story of your game and the story of your studio in order to make it easier for journalists, game journalists, to write a story about you. So one of the ways to get attention is through game journalism. That's not always the way anymore. It's not as common as it used to be for getting games through, and so it creates its own challenges. But it doesn't hurt to have this in your back pocket. So when we talked about design, we did talk about that you sort of have your own interesting experience, your own sort of story to tell, and the thing that you want to share with people. The more you have that kind of interesting thing about you and your team and your studio, the more somebody might actually want to write about you as well. So it's not necessarily just the game, but it's usually the people behind the game that the journalists want to write about. And so in fact, if you were to pick up the book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier again, you would see that he's actually he's writing about the people behind the game. He's not necessarily writing about the game at all. What it's like to play the games. He's talking about the people behind the games, because that's the interesting story in this case. And so that's the interesting story that people will want to tell others about your game. And so you should figure out what's interesting about you and make sure you share it. And that could be a challenge, but it's certainly one that's necessary to figure out how to market it. And then, of course, there's a variety of festivals. There are the independent games festivals, Indiecades. You can try to join as a conference speaker at GDC or otherwise. It can be hard to get into those spaces because there are so many people trying to get in there as speakers. So just showing up is one thing, and shaking hands is another. But being there, talking to people starts to get that word of mouth out. But it can be expensive to get to these places. So that's a challenge. It's not as expensive as a traditional marketing campaign where you actually purchase advertising. It's much less money to go to a conference than it is to do that, especially if you just send one person to a conference. It's usually like between $3,000 and $8,000 or whatever. GDC is actually very expensive, but you don't necessarily have to go the entire time. You can get cheaper tickets, like you can get $1,000 ticket or whatever. You still have to get there and all that, but that's less money than you'd pay to, say, run a really good ad campaign across Google, or to use Twitter or Facebook to get a really good ad campaign going. You can certainly spend a small amount of money, but you also only get a small amount of return. And of course, doing like a TV advertisement is much, much more expensive than any of that. And so there's a number of ways that you can get creative about advertising that goes beyond word of mouth and goes beyond getting a journalist to write about you, that you're actually paying money for. And it might be worth considering, but it's kind of a gamble as to how much money is going to come out of it. Okay, so how do you get that first game going? So let's assume that you don't have any money and you're trying to get out there. Well, one is to just be as cheap as possible, and you have that opportunity if you're just getting out of college and you're not very expensive. You know how to live off of ramen and mac and cheese. You might have to have a day job at a grocery store or something to kind of cover your rent. But maybe you can, get a small amount of sleep and sort of crunch for 2 years in order to get that first game out. Maybe. Kickstarter is kind of good and bad. It continues to be the case that $50,000 is a reasonable target. Some games are getting to $150,000 in some cases still. Games that came out that were getting $4 million or $5 million hits just aren't happening anymore. I haven't seen that in quite a while. So it started out that way. In fact, Tim Schafer's game was kind of one of the first that came out that hit like $3.5 million on Kickstarter. And so it was great for them, and now they're purchased by Microsoft. So they sort of kickstarted their way into getting bought out. In fact, all of the big Kickstarter games, inXile, Obsidian, Double Fine, all of those companies that were doing really well on Kickstarter for a while and getting multi-million-dollar Kickstarters, and then they've now been all purchased by Microsoft, and so Microsoft kind of owns the world of the former Kickstarter space. So Kickstarter certainly exists and certainly a way to get money, but it's not enough to cover it, right? So $50,000 isn't enough to carry you through a $350,000 game. It's enough that if you're able to make the game mostly, you might be able to pay some contract fees for better audio, or maybe improve some art, or even get some advertising out of it. And of course, the Kickstarter itself, a very successful Kickstarter, still ends up being pretty reasonable in advertising. You get 10 to 20,000 eyeballs on it. Those 10 to 20,000 people might actually have 10 to 20,000 friends that they will tell about your game. And that might be enough to get you that extra 10,000 sales when the game actually comes out, if they're playing it, and if it's enough that they can talk about the experience and so on. So there's certainly the free advertising aspect and all that, but there's a lot of gotchas. A lot of people were doing weird physical rewards with their Kickstarters and ended up spending all of their Kickstarter money just trying to fulfill those rewards rather than making the game, and so it didn't work out. So Fig is an interesting one. It actually was recently purchased by a company called Republic, which does microfinancing, and Fig really was kind of a microfinancing thing. So it was sort of a mix between Kickstarter and basically investing in video games. I don't know what its status is. It actually kind of looks like a dead website where it sits right now. I think it's in hiatus. But this kind of thing can potentially be a carryover future, assuming it comes back up and becomes something. But in that space, when you were a small game, getting that $300,000 target was actually pretty reasonable, because people were not just doing the Kickstarter thing where they're pre-purchasing your potential game down the road. They were maybe putting in $100 or $250 or $500 or $1,000 with the expectation that then they would get some of your profit. And so the good news there is that you get that $300,000. The bad news is that if your game only makes $300,000 on the other end, you have to give up even more of that money. So not just giving it up to Steam and not just giving it up to Unreal, you're also now giving it up to your shareholders. But where it stands now, I'm not sure, and where the future will be with that is hard to say. But that's certainly something that has existed, and people continue to kind of seek out that space to see if there's an opportunity for alternative paths rather than having to find a publisher. But this whole thing kind of ebbs and flows as it goes. And then finally, the Steam Early Access, you can potentially make your game most of the way and then get on early access and finish it, right? So people are actually paying for a game on early access in order to potentially, seek out the good games early on, maybe start to learn to play them. Really, if it's a play once and move on game, it doesn't work in early access. It's very similar to the Let's Play streaming kind of thing. And a lot of those games that kind of are replayable can also live in early access for a very long time. And there's numbers of stories, and Minecraft was a big one, where it was actually sort of in a pre-release state before 1.0 release for many, many years, and people were still putting tons of money into it. Star Citizen is another one where people are putting tons of money into it, and it doesn't technically exist as a released product yet because they're replayable. The replayability is the core to it. And so, not to discourage you from making a strictly narrative one playthrough kind of game, but unfortunately that's kind of the reality. If you want to do that, you might be a hobbyist, because you might not actually make enough money to sort of make the investment worth it, or to make enough money on the back end to keep making games after the fact. Okay, and lastly, I'll give a brief another brief pass at the large businesses. We've talked about it from a couple different standpoints. Usually, as somebody coming into the company, you will just get your job and you will work at your job from 9 to 5, hopefully not 9 to 9. And you will do that for a decent career. And I know a lot of people that have great careers and move every couple of years to find a new game, and have worked on a lot of exciting games and have enjoyed their lives very much working on the very cool games that you've heard of and have played. So that's the treat of working for the big companies. That you're not going to get rich, but you will certainly have a good time doing it, and you will be able to have a house or an apartment and pay for food and all that kind of good stuff that comes from having a job. So that is a way to look at it. So the way the business works on that end is almost entirely different. So often what's happening is that they have teams of 10 to 100 people, right? So rather than 2 people, it's a huge team, and that's where a lot of your money comes from. So if you're paying 100 people, each around $100,000 in overhead, you suddenly have $1 million budget, right? Or 10 to $100 million budget. And so that's where you get the budgets that seem like they're excessive, where you've got 10 or 100 or $150 million to bring a game together. But if you have a team that large and they're working for 2 to 3 years, it's not that hard to start hitting that figure, right? Even a team of 10 and 20, suddenly it becomes hard to keep it below 5 or 10 or $20 million. And so that means on the back end, the actual return, the revenue from the game has to be more than that. It has to be at least as much as you put in. And it probably needs to be more than that, because if you're a large company, you have shareholders who all want to invest and want to make some profit off of your company. And so that's where a lot of that extra money goes to, is the shareholders, and trying to make the profit and increasing your profits, which is both a thing that happens and may be a bad thing, but it still is something that happens. So one of the strategies that these large companies will do is actually go even higher, and because the odds of any given game being successful are low, what you look for is 10 to 20 games with all the chance of making not just the money back, but 10 times the money back or 100 times the money back. Because if you can invest in 10 products or 20 products that all potentially could make 20 or 100 times their profit, then as long as one of those does that, one of your 20 games that you've invested in, you've paid for all 20 games and then some, right? And so that's where that model comes from. This is how like the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley work. They're all funding multiple companies that could become the next Airbnb or the next Google or whatever it is. And so they're funding 10, 20, 30 companies. One of those needs to be the company that's going to make 100 times profit. And so they're looking for every idea has to be the one that they think is going to sell that much. That's one of the places where you see a big lack of creativity in these kinds of games, is that they're looking for the game that they think is going to come out and make that many sales, right? And so early on, maybe you're getting lucky and striking it as a smaller company, and then you can get the big investment from some publisher who wants to put money into your game because you're making a version 2, right? You're making a sequel to the game, and so now it's well known that that game made pretty good money, and so they'll put a lot more money into it because they expect that, given that your original game made a lot of money, your number 2 version should make even more, and so people want to invest in that and participate in some of that. What's also kind of weird is the fact that the $60 game price tag has now existed for almost 30 years. And that's weird, because usually prices increase over time. And it used to be that you might only pay $40 back in the 1980s for a Mario game, but that felt like what today would be paying like $80 or $90. Now what's interesting is that back then you might pay that much money for a game, but then you'd also play it for much, much longer, because that was kind of the only game you had, because there weren't that many other games. Now there was that period of the glut that led to almost the cancellation of the market, but with something like Nintendo, there just weren't as many games even on the original Nintendo as there are that come out for any given day or any given month on Steam. And so there's tons of games out there. So that may be one of the things that's driving the price down, because you have just so much supply. But the games still cost more and more to make, and so that's part of where you see a lot of these other things happening, where they're doing graduated editions, collector's editions, ultimate editions. They're trying to make $80 a new normal, and it's kind of getting there, and it may get there in the next generation, because games continue to be growing expensive. You have to pay people more and more money in terms of their salaries, and you can't live off of just trying to get more and more people to buy games. So you have to do something, or else the whole system is going to break down. One is to just reduce the development costs, of course, but to make these big blockbuster games, something has to happen, and we all kind of enjoy them, right? There's a reason that they're kind of big, and everyone enjoys playing some of these big games. So hopefully, we can figure out a balance, but luckily I'm not. Somebody has to figure that out. So there's a number of ways that they're doing that, and some of them are a bit less than stellar, less than moral in terms of the way they take advantage of things, and that's certainly not justifiable, right? So the graduated editions, this idea of basic, collector, and ultimate edition, actually kind of feels pretty good, right? So it feels like you can get the game at the same price that you always get, and it's okay, or it has felt pretty good in the past. And then for the collector's edition, you get maybe a little bit extra stuff. Often, it used to be that the collector's edition or the ultimate edition would have like extra physical goods, right? So a cool helmet or some kind of plastic gun thing that probably doesn't cost as much money as you're paying to get that edition, right? So that extra $20, they might only pay like $5 for that, but then they get to get some extra profit out of it because you're such a big fan of the game. Unfortunately, a lot of what happens now and continues to happen is there are new things that are locked behind that paywall, so that you don't get the complete game unless you get the ultimate edition, and that doesn't feel as good, right? That doesn't feel as good as, well, I'm just a huge fan and I get some cool like little thing that I can put on a shelf. But now it's now to just even play the game, you have to really pay the full $80, and so the $60 person just feels gypped out of the game experience. So that's not great. And that's the same thing with like the way DLC and season passes can work, is that you get the base game, and then really they've planned for the season passes, and that's where the full game comes out. Especially with the 0-day DLCs, where you just have to pay an extra thing. Loot boxes have a really bad reputation because they simply are gambling, and it's especially galling when you've paid $60 for a game, and then you also have this gambling mechanic on the back end of it, that you are gambling to see whether or not you're going to actually enjoy the game. Rather than just paying $60 and enjoying the game, and then the loot boxes are free, exciting thing that comes out of the game. So loot boxes, it can actually go back to this question of endogenous and exogenous value, in that, in one sense, if the loot box actually contains items with endogenous value, your experience of the game improves or doesn't improve based on whether or not you get those items, right? So usually it's exogenous value. Usually it's just extra skins that aren't necessarily going to change the game. And what can happen is if you make those kinds of things free and you simply get them by playing the game, it sort of, even though it's an exogenous value, it's a different skin that you can play with. If it's a repeatable game that you enjoy playing anyway, it gives you a different feel when you play the game to have a different skin, right? Or a different look or a different sound. It's an extra treat that doesn't necessarily add to the gameplay, but does add to the player experience, adds to that extra feel, the customization of the player, just an extra reward to remind the player that it's great that they played this game. And so loot boxes could have been something like that, but unfortunately they tied money to it and made it a gamble that required people to pay more money into it, and so it wasn't that great in the end. But hopefully innovation from somewhere else other than maybe the business side will continue, but we'll see what the future holds in terms of this sort of tension between the fact that games probably should cost more than they do, but they currently don't still. Okay, so with that, we've talked about the indie approach. We've now talked about the big business approach. Hopefully, you come away with this with the idea that maybe you still want to do this. If you were coming into games because you wanted to get rich, I have some bad news for you. But if you're coming into games because you want to make games and you want to have a reasonable amount of, you want to put food on the table and enjoy your life, there's certainly an option for you, whether you go indie, whether you go for the big business. Depending on the amount of control you want over your creativity or how much enjoyment you get out of what it is you're creating. Just simply working for a large company and working on a piece of a very large and very cool game is not a bad thing necessarily. So it doesn't have to be that you have to create your own games to feel really good about it. But certainly, if you are coming into games and you want to make a living, there's a way to do that.